At the beginning of this trial, I told all of you that this was going to be a simple case. And it still is. It still is a simple case. Now, I wrote down a bunch of things that have come out during the trial, and I'm going to address those in just a little bit. But when you go back into that jury room, there are two main things you have to bring with you. The first is the evidence. The evidence that you've heard here today, in the form of testimony coming from the stand, in the form of the video clips that you watched. That's what you have to bring back there with you. Also, you need to bring your common sense. The judge will inform you that you can't bring back feelings of sympathy or bias, hatred or dislike. You have to go in there with the evidence, the law, as the judge will instruct you on it, and your common sense. And before I get to the evidence, I want to talk about the law. The law as the judge will instruct you. To prove the crime of resisting an officer without violence, the state must prove the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. 1, Carlos Miller resisted, opposed, or obstructed Lieutenant Diepa and or Major Perez. 2, at the time, Lieutenant Diepa and or Major Perez were engaged in the lawful execution of a legal process and or legal duty. 3, at the time, Lieutenant Diepa and or Major Perez were law enforcement officers. And 4, at the time, Carlos Miller knew that Lieutenant Diepa and or Major Perez were law enforcement officers. Now let's go through the evidence that we've heard here today. You remember the judge told you earlier, what the lawyers say is not evidence, and you're not to consider it when you go back into that jury room. So let's talk about the evidence we heard in the form of testimony and in the form of those video clips that we saw. The defense would have you believe that the defendant is a journalist, not a protester. He's a journalist. And yet, when you use your common sense, you don't have to read manuals on journalistic ethics. You don't have to know a journalist. No. When you use your common sense, it'll tell you that a journalist doesn't wear a black bandana at a protest, at a highly charged, in an atmosphere that's highly charged with emotion and has the potential to be dangerous. No. A journalist doesn't wear a black bandana to cover his face. A journalist doesn't make themselves part of the story. A journalist documents a story. Does not insert themselves inside the story. A journalist does not antagonize police officers. If a journalist is told, you can't be here, journalist listens. A journalist's job is not to question the authority of police officers. And yet, the evidence showed us here tonight that that's exactly what happened, again and again. That the defendant continuously resisted the commands of the officers there that night. And you heard the testimony of Lieutenant Diepa. He told you. I stood there and he drew it up there for you, right here on the board. My colleague, Mr. Graham, asked him, how many times did you give that dispersal order? And he said, you know what, I can't be sure exactly how many times, but I gave it at least 3 times. And it was given in English, it was given in Spanish, it was given in Creole. And it was given on the west side of the field, on the east side of the field, on the north side of the field, and on the south side of the field. Why? So that people in different areas of this field would hear the dispersal order. so that there wouldn't be someone left saying to themselves, can I be here, or do I have to leave? And you have no reason to doubt whether the defendant heard the dispersal order. And let's think about why. You saw a video clip.
Excuse me, Tony, they're printing. I'm sorry to interrupt you. The final paragraph, apologies.
Well, we saw a video clip of Lieutenant Dieppe giving the dispersal order on the megaphone. And then we saw the defendant standing no more than 15, 20 feet away. So we know that it didn't take Lieutenant Dieppe giving the order from all four quadrants of the field for the defendant to know that there was a dispersal order, that he had to leave. You know the defendant heard that order. Now, and I wrote this down, the defendant's attorney pointed out on cross-examination someone in a video who was part of the media. And how do we know who's part of the media? How do we know who is media on that night? How do we know? Are they wearing a jacket that says Channel 7 News or Channel 10 News? Or is there a Channel 10 helicopter hovering overhead? No. Some journalists are in different places, but they have credentials. We saw a journalist with credentials, something to identify them as being journalists and as not being part of the protesters. And yet, here's the defendant, not behind police lines, where the media was, on the protester side of police lines, in a black bandana, coming up to officers, as you heard from the officers on the stand, asking, why can't I get through this line? Why not? Why not? Why can't I get through? Why can't we get through? And I asked Mr. Bravo, what does it mean to you when the defendant says, why can't we get through, when he's standing next to protesters? And Mr. Bravo told you, well, to me, he's referring to himself and the protesters. You don't need Mr. Bravo to tell you that, because all you have to do is just ask yourself and use your common sense. What does that mean? Is this someone who's a journalist, who's there objectively documenting a story? Or is this someone who's become part of the story? Who's one of these protesters? And that gets me to another point. Even if you don't want to call the defendant a protester, even if you believe that the defendant couldn't care less about Occupy Miami, what they stand for, at all, could not care less. Even if you believe that, it's not the point. The point is simple. The defendant was given a direct order by police officers to leave. Those police officers who gave that order were required to give that order. They had a legal duty to do so. They're police officers in Miami-Dade County. And when they are given orders, they have to follow them. Just the same way when a police officer is dispatched somewhere, that's an order. Do your job as a police officer. They have to listen to that order. That's the way it works. So when the police officers gave the defendant the order to leave, he had to leave. That's what this is about. Not whether he's a protester. It's about him disobeying commands. You know, and they want you to believe so badly that he's a journalist, as if being a journalist is his saving grace. He's just a journalist. But you remember when the defense witness took the stand, the man who works for the Miami Herald, and he told you, well, towards the end of the night, the protest was kind of over. There was no real story there. So I left. So he left. He told you there was no reason for him, a journalist who works for the Miami Herald, is he said a critic and writes various articles and sometimes does some reporting, that there was no more reporting to be done. This wasn't a place for a journalist. And yet the defendant, who they would have you believe is a journalist, wants to be in this area. For what? You got to ask yourself, for what? And use your common sense here. And we heard a lot of things pointed out by the defense. Who is that person in the screen, in the distance there, at night? You can barely see. Who is that? I don't know. You don't know who that is? Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that someone doesn't know whether someone is Channel 7 News or Channel 10 News is not the issue. The fact that a police officer might not know why a particular person was not arrested is not the issue here. The issue is that the defendant was told repeatedly, you can't be here. And chose to be there. He chose not to obey those orders. And when the defendant did that again and again and again, he committed the crime of resisting an officer without violence. Lieutenant Dieppe and Major Perez were executing a legal duty. And we talked about what their duty was. To clear the people out from around the Miami-Dade Government Center and to secure the perimeter around the Miami-Dade Government Center. And we know the reason why. There are hundreds of people at the Miami-Dade Government Center. You can't just send people flocking into the streets. Yes, we have to clear the people from the Miami-Dade Government Center. But we also have to make sure that they're not running amok in the traffic, that they're kept safe and they're not run over. We know that the defendant knew that he was dealing with police officers. We had people investing police with batons and shields and helmets. People identifying themselves as Miami-Dade police officers. You heard the dispersal order as I read it to you in my opening statement. And you heard Officer Dieppe tell you, this is Officer Dieppe of the Miami-Dade Police Department. I hereby command all persons so assembled to immediately and peaceably depart the area. If not, you'll be subject to arrest. Knowing that he would be subject to arrest, the defendant chose to stay. He would not leave the area. And maybe he left the field around the Miami-Dade Government Center, but he would not leave the perimeter that the police department had set up. The perimeter that they had set up under their direct orders to do so, and because they had to protect the public. They had to protect themselves. You have officers who are in marching lineups, and you heard my colleague ask Major Perez, they can't get out of that lineup. They have to stay in formation. And because they have to stay in formation, we have to look out for officer safety. So when the defendant runs up behind the police officers, it compromises officer safety. And that's when the defendant is placed under arrest. But the fact is, the defendant could have been placed under arrest much earlier. He could have been placed under arrest a whole slew of times. But Major Perez told you, they wanted to give people a chance to get out of the area. They gave a dispersal order, they set up a perimeter, they want people to get out of the area. Their primary concern is to clear the government center and secure the perimeter. So when you go into that jury room, you're not going to think about what the lawyers have said here, the cross-examination, none of that. You're going to go in there, and you're going to have the DVDs that we watched. And you're going to have the testimony in your minds, what these officers told you on the stand. These officers have nothing to gain here. These are officers who were there for a simple purpose. So you're going to think about that testimony and the video that you saw. You're going to think about the evidence that you've heard. There's no reason to doubt what happened here. Absolutely none. And so when you take those two things and you put them together with your common sense about what journalists do, what protesters do, and about what you have to do when an officer tells you to do something, you're going to come back with the only verdict that's consistent with those things, without any feelings of bias or prejudice, none of that. The only verdict that's consistent with the evidence, your common sense, and the law. And that is a verdict of guilty.